I was 12 when my world turned upside down. That morning began like any other. Dad kissed me goodbye before heading off to work at the construction company, where he was a site manager. His hands smelled of wood shavings and something metallic, and his smile was so warm that I wanted to linger by the door just a little longer. But I simply nodded and smiled back. Mom, sitting at the kitchen table with her phone in hand, glanced up briefly, nodded, and then returned to her screen. I remember thinking how strange it was. They were so different, yet always together. My name is Stephanie Carter, and that was the last time I saw my father alive. That day, he collapsed at work from a massive heart attack. They said it was instantaneous. He didn't even feel pain. But no one thought something like this could happen so suddenly. I was in math class when the principal knocked on the classroom door. Her face was tense, and I knew right away something had happened. She silently motioned for me to step out. In her office, Mom was already there. Her hair was neatly styled, her mascara hadn't smudged a bit, and her face was as cold and composed as always. "Your father passed away," she said, her voice steady, almost too steady. I remember my legs giving out, tears welling up in my eyes instantly. Mom waited until I started sobbing before hugging me. Her hands moved mechanically over my back, as if she was trying to remember what she was supposed to do next. That evening, I was curled up on my bed hugging a pillow when I heard Mom talking on the phone. Her voice carried through the thin walls of the house, and I didn't even try to eavesdrop. It was impossible not to hear. "Honestly, Linda, this might be for the best," she said quietly but distinctly. My heart clenched, and I stopped breathing for a moment. Being a widow is far more respectable than being divorced. And besides, I'll get to keep everything without the hassle of lawyers. She laughed. She actually laughed. That laugh, thin and cold like an icy wind, shattered the silence of the house. I know, Mom continued. "I'll play the grieving widow at the funeral. I already picked out the perfect black dress." I sat on the staircase, pressing my hand tightly over my mouth to keep from screaming. Tears burned my eyes, but I held them back, even though everything inside me wanted to scream. At Dad's funeral, his sister Sarah was the only one who seemed to see through Mom. She stood off to the side, watching with a faintly reproachful look, shaking her head sadly. Everyone else offered condolences to my grief-stricken mother, who played her part flawlessly. It felt so unreal that I hardly had any tears left to say goodbye to Dad. Everything had burned up inside me. But it didn't take long for Mom to heal from her loss. 3 months later, I met him, Richard Thompson, for the first time. He was tall, impeccably dressed, with perfect hair and gleaming teeth that he showed off in frequent smiles. He had 2 kids, Brandon, who was 11, and Emma, who was 10. That evening, Mom prepared an elaborate dinner, something with salmon and a wine sauce, dishes she'd never made for Dad. Everything felt too unreal, as if someone had replaced my mother. "Stephanie, sweetheart," Mom said one evening, her voice unnaturally sweet, as if she were talking to a small child. She and Richard were sitting on the couch, holding hands. "We have something important to tell you," she continued, and I didn't need to hear the rest. From the way her eyes sparkled and her smile stretched wide with happiness, I already knew. "We're getting married," Mom announced, as if it were the most wonderful news in the world. "Isn't that great? You'll have a new father and siblings." I forced myself to smile. "That's great, Mom. Congratulations." Richard smiled too, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. It was empty, cold. "Brandon and Emma are so excited to have a new sister," he added. But I saw his kids standing behind him, their faces full of distrust and tension. When Brandon and Emma came over, they looked at me as if I were something stuck to the bottom of their expensive sneakers. Their disdainful gazes pierced through me, but I didn't let myself break in front of them. I kept everything inside: anger, resentment, helplessness. But one night, when it became too much, I called Aunt Sarah. Her voice, warm and soothing like a soft blanket, was the only thing that could comfort me. I cried for hours, pouring out everything I had bottled up for so long. Aunt Sarah listened patiently, occasionally offering gentle words of comfort. Then she said something that stayed with me forever. Sometimes, sweetheart, the family you choose is more important than the one you're born into. Remember that. Her words became an anchor for me, something I clung to whenever life's injustices came crashing down. Brandon and Emma moved in a week after Mom and Richard's honeymoon. They immediately claimed the best rooms in the house. My cozy playroom, where I'd spent so many happy hours, was turned into Emma's art studio. When I tried to protest, Mom shut me down sharply. Don't be selfish, Stephanie. We need to make them feel welcome. Her tone was dry, cutting off any chance of dialogue. After the wedding, Mom became a completely different person. She spent hours helping Emma with her homework, shopping with her, and watching Brandon play football. Meanwhile, I ate dinner alone in my room, feeling like a ghost in my own house. The way Mom looked at Richard, the way her eyes lit up at his every word, felt utterly alien to me. I had never seen her look at my dad that way. Brandon needs new cleats for football, Mom said with enthusiasm, as if it were the most pressing issue in the world. Or, Emma's taking art classes this summer. It's such a wonderful opportunity for her. There was always money for their needs. Meanwhile, I learned not to ask for anything. Even something as simple as new pencils for school became a source of conflict. I had to explain why I needed them at all and feel guilty for daring to ask. They began traveling together, even if only for short trips, weekend getaways to nearby towns or hikes in national parks. I was never invited to join them. "You be bored," Mom would say, not even looking at me as she packed snacks for Brandon and Emma. Besides, someone has to feed the cat. Those trips became a symbol of how far removed I was from their new perfect world. Instead of going on those trips, I spent time at Aunt Sarah's. Her small cottage at the end of a quiet street became my real home. She never had children of her own, but she cared for me as if I were her daughter. She baked me pies, listened to my worries, and filled her home with a warmth I thought I'd lost forever. "It's not right, Stephanie," she said one evening, watching me unpack my overnight bag for what felt like the 100th time. "A mother shouldn't play favorites." I shrugged, pretending it didn't bother me. But inside, it hurt deeply. When I turned 16, I finally decided to talk about my future. During dinner, when everyone seemed to be in a good mood, I cautiously brought up the subject of college. "I've been looking into a few schools," I began. "I really want to study business management." I chose my words carefully, trying not to upset anyone. Mom froze. Her fork clattered onto her plate with a dull thud. "College, Stephanie," she said, her voice carrying a barely hidden note of mocking irritation. "We can't afford to send you to college. We need to think about Brandon and Emma's education." The room fell silent, broken only by Brandon's snickers and Emma's smug smile. Richard didn't even look up, continuing to eat as if the conversation had nothing to do with him. Later, after everyone had left the table, I cornered Mom in the kitchen. "What about Dad's money?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "He had life insurance. He saved for us for years." Mom's face hardened. "I spent that money on you," she said coldly. "For years, Stephanie. Food, clothes, a roof over your head. Did you think all of that was free?" She clicked her tongue. "Stop being so entitled. You can't just demand things from me." Her words echoed in my mind like a frosty wind. That was the moment I fully understood. In her eyes, I was nothing more than an obligation, a burdensome reminder of the past. I stood there, stunned by her icy tone and blatant lies. Dad had worked so hard all his life to secure my future, to ensure I could pursue my dreams. And now, all of it had been spent on her new, perfect family, while I, his only daughter, was left on the sidelines of their happy life. Anger and pain filled my chest, but I held it in, saying nothing. The weekend was approaching, and I knew where I'd find comfort. The next morning, I headed to Aunt Sarah's house. I couldn't hold back my tears and let them stream down my face as I walked through the quiet streets. When I entered her cozy home, the smell of fresh coffee filled the air, and the warmth dulled the ache in my heart just a little. We sat at her kitchen table, soft light pouring in from the window, and I told her everything, every detail, every hurt, everything I'd been holding inside. Aunt Sarah listened silently, her hands wrapped around a mug as though its warmth could somehow transfer to me. Her eyes were filled with sympathy and pain, but she didn't interrupt. When I finished, she stood up without saying a word and disappeared into her study. I heard the sound of drawers opening and closing, and then she returned with a thick envelope. She placed it on the table in front of me and slid it toward me gently. "Your father came to me about 2 weeks before he passed," she said softly. It was strange. He seemed worried, as if he knew something might happen. "He gave me this and made me promise to keep it safe until you were ready for college." My hands trembled as I opened the envelope. Inside was a bank statement showing a savings account in my name. Aunt Sarah was listed as the trustee. Dad had been quietly saving money for me for years. Her voice was gentle as she continued, "He said your mom had been acting differently than before. He was worried about you. He wanted to make sure your future would be secure, no matter what happened." I couldn't hold back. Tears streamed down my cheeks again, but this time they were tears of gratitude and love for the father who had continued to protect me even after his death. "We can't tell Mom about this," I whispered, wiping my eyes. Aunt Sarah nodded in agreement. Over the next 2 years, I focused on my studies, saying nothing about my plans at home. I pored over college catalogs and watched campus tours online, dreaming of my future. Brandon and Emma never missed a chance to remind me where they thought I belonged. "Hey, Stephanie," Brandon said with a smirk one day. "I heard the diner downtown is looking for a dishwasher. Better hurry before someone else snags the job." Emma laughed, adding, "Maybe if you're lucky, they'll let you wipe tables too." They found it endlessly amusing, but I walked past them silently, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. My silence drove them crazy. And then the day of my graduation arrived. I had barely taken off my cap and gown when Mom and Richard called me into the living room for a serious conversation. They were seated on the couch like judges preparing to deliver a verdict. I stood in front of them, feeling the tension thickening in the air. "Stephanie," Richard began in a stern tone. His face was expressionless, like a carved stone. "You're 18 now. We've been generous, letting you stay here, but you need to understand, you can't live here forever. You need to find a job and start earning your own living." I smiled calmly, surprising them with my composure. "I completely understand. I'll be moving out next week." They exchanged startled glances, clearly expecting resistance, tears, pleas, arguments. But none of that came. Mom opened her mouth as if to say something, but no words came out. "Well, good," Richard finally said, his voice faltering. "That's very mature of you." Neither of them asked questions. No one wondered where I would go or how I would support myself. Their indifference didn't surprise me, but it still left a bitter taste in my mouth. The next day, I went to Aunt Sarah's to discuss my plans. Her little house had become my safe haven, and she was my true family. By then, I knew that my future wasn't in the hands of those who had cast me aside, it was in my own. They were too relieved by how easily I agreed to leave to risk asking any questions that might complicate things. The day of my move came faster than I expected. I packed my belongings into 4 cardboard boxes and 2 suitcases. It was surprising how little I had accumulated over the years. It felt as if I'd subconsciously prepared for this moment, ready to leave without leaving anything behind. Aunt Sarah pulled up in her blue Honda right at 9 in the morning. I stood at my bedroom window, watching her park in front of our house. Part of me expected Mom or at least Richard to come out and see what was happening. But the house remained silent. Only a shift in the curtains of Emma's room revealed that someone was watching. I paid it no mind. As we drove away, I watched the house of my childhood shrink in the rearview mirror until it disappeared completely. I didn't cry. Instead, I felt a weight lifting off my shoulders with every mile we put between me and that house, a weight made of pretense, lies, and disappointment. That summer, I worked at a small cafe called Sunshine. It smelled of freshly ground coffee, warm pastries, and something comforting that words couldn't quite describe. I served coffee and sandwiches to regulars who left generous tips and treated me like family. The owner, Mrs. Peterson, was a kind woman who even let me take on extra shifts to save more for college. By September, I was ready for the next chapter of my life. On the day I boarded a plane to Marshall State University, I felt no fear, just excitement and anticipation. The university was 3 states away from where I'd grown up, and it felt like I was flying not just to a new place but into a new life. The business management program was challenging, but that only fueled my determination. I threw myself into my studies, making the most of every opportunity. My roommate, Jessica, became my first real friend in years. She was outgoing, funny, and, most importantly, genuine. At first, I didn't tell her about my family, but one day, when I finally opened up, she simply hugged me and said, "They lost a daughter. They lost a mom." Her words hit me harder than I expected. They were true, but for the first time, they didn't feel like a condemnation, just a fact I could accept. Mom's Facebook page became my window into the life I had left behind. In photos, they looked like the perfect family: Mom, Richard, Brandon, and Emma. Smiling at Brandon's football tournaments, celebrating Emma's wins at art competitions, taking selfies on vacation beaches. The captions sounded like they were written by a PR consultant: "So proud of our amazing kids," or "Nothing beats family time." I was never mentioned. Not once. It was as if I didn't exist. I spent holidays in Aunt Sarah's kitchen. We watched old movies, cooked together, and laughed about my endless failures with pie dough. We created our own traditions, ones that meant more to me than any forced family dinners ever had. Sometimes Aunt Sarah would notice me scrolling through Mom's posts and gently take my phone away. "Don't torture yourself," she'd say. "You're writing your own story now." And I was. My senior year of college became the culmination of all my efforts. I graduated with honors, earning my degree summa cum laude. Thanks to internships and academic achievements, I already had job offers lined up. Jessica's father, Mr. Reynolds, owned a large marketing firm and noticed my work during one of our class project presentations. "We need sharp minds like yours," he said during my interview. "Your professors speak very highly of you." I started as a junior analyst, but I had no intention of staying at that level for long. I took on extra projects, worked late, and studied market trends. Over the next 5 years, I earned 2 promotions. By then, I had saved enough to put a down payment on my own apartment. The day I signed the mortgage papers, I stood in my new, empty living room. Sunlight streamed onto the walls, and in my hand, I held the keys that were now mine alone. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to cry. These were tears of happiness, of pride, for the realization that I had achieved everything on my own terms, thanks to hard work and the people who truly believed in me. The biggest surprise came one morning, about 7 years ago, when Mr. Reynolds called me into his office. He was a man with a firm but kind demeanor, someone who had a knack for connecting with every employee. He rarely summoned anyone without good reason, so I immediately knew this was about something important. "We're creating a new position," he began, sliding a folder across the desk toward me. His voice was steady, almost formal, but there was a warmth in his eyes, something paternal and proud. "Senior Director of Strategic Development. The board and I were unanimous. You're the right person for the job." I opened the folder, and for a moment, my heart stopped. My eyes landed on the salary figure, and I almost gasped. It was more than I'd ever imagined, especially at my age. I sat across from him, doing my best not to show my shock, and finally managed, "Thank you for this opportunity. I won't let you down." Walking out of his office that day, I realized just how far I'd come since leaving home. But I'd never felt the need to broadcast my life online. Sure, I had social media accounts, but I used them sparingly, sharing occasional snapshots, sunsets, cozy cafes, books on wooden tables. It was my personal space, free from the need to prove anything or display curated happiness. Aunt Sarah, as always, was the only person I shared my accomplishments with. She knew about my promotion, my apartment, and the new black Mercedes I had bought as a reward for this next step forward. "You've earned every bit of it," she said proudly when I told her. She had always believed in me and continued to support me no matter what. Meanwhile, Brandon and Emma's social media feeds were a continuous display of mediocrity. Brandon posed next to his used Hyundai Elantra, captioning photos with phrases like, "Living the luxury life you dream of." Emma posted pictures from the local mall, tagging brands I knew she couldn't afford. One day, I stumbled upon a post from Brandon that made me laugh out loud. He was standing next to his car at a local auto show, and the caption read, "When hard work pays off. Success is a choice." I read it while sitting in my AMG Mercedes, which cost more than his annual salary. But I had no desire to prove anything to anyone. I simply scrolled past. And then came the message that changed everything. It popped up on my Facebook feed one Tuesday morning. "Stephanie, this is your mother. I'm turning 55 next month, and I'm hosting a celebration at an upscale restaurant, Le Blanc, which you've probably never heard of. I expect you to attend. It will be on the 15th at 7 p.m. Don't embarrass me." I stared at the screen, rereading the message over and over. 12 years of silence, and this was how she chose to reach out. "No, how are you?" No attempt to mend fences. Just a command laced with a subtle jab about the upscale restaurant. I almost deleted the message right then and there, but something stopped me. Maybe curiosity. Or a strange desire to see what would happen next. I called Mr. Reynolds and requested a week off. That evening, sitting at Aunt Sarah's cozy kitchen table with a cup of tea, I told her about the invitation. She raised an eyebrow and, biting her lip, asked, "So, what are you planning to get her?" I smiled, pulling out my phone to show her an email confirmation. A luxury trip to the Maldives. 2 weeks at a 5-star resort, including first-class flights. Total cost, about $15,000. Aunt Sarah's eyes widened. "Stephanie, that's way too much. She doesn't deserve it." "Oh, I know she doesn't deserve it," I replied calmly, a faint smile curling my lips. Aunt Sarah gave me a look of mixed curiosity and disbelief but said nothing. She knew I had my reasons. I laughed, taking a sip of tea, and looked at her. But can you imagine her face when she realizes what she's missed out on all these years? The daughter she threw away turned out to be far more successful than she ever expected. I paused, letting the words hang in the air before adding, "I want to see her reaction when she realizes just how wrong she was about me." Aunt Sarah chuckled and shook her head. "You're a little wicked, Stephanie. But I like it." The day of Mom's birthday celebration arrived. I wore a Chanel dress, simple but elegant, a classic black number that probably cost more than a dozen of the flashy outfits I expected to see at the party. I deliberately took a taxi instead of driving my Mercedes. The idea of them speculating about my life amused me. When I arrived at LeBlanc, the restaurant immediately lived up to my expectations. It was exactly the kind of place meant to impress people who had never been to a truly high-end establishment. They served frozen seafood drenched in overly showy sauces and desserts adorned with edible gold leaf. Places like this I only visited for corporate dinners, where appearances mattered more than the food itself. The hostess escorted me to a private room where the party was already in full swing. Mom sat at the head of a long table in a sequin dress that sparkled brightly under an enormous crystal chandelier. Richard was seated beside her, with Brandon and Emma flanking them like a royal entourage. The rest of the table was filled with relatives I hadn't seen in over a decade. There was Aunt Linda, who used to pinch my cheeks far too hard. Cousin Rachel, always bragging about her kids. Familiar faces from my past, suddenly brought back into my life for one evening. Mom's eyes flicked over me, and her lips twisted slightly. "Oh, Stephanie, you made it. You could have dressed up a little more for the occasion." I said nothing, just smiled and took a seat at the far end of the table. From there, I could quietly observe the proceedings without drawing much attention to myself. The gifts started coming out one by one. Aunt Linda handed Mom a set of scented candles. "They're from that cute little shop at the mall," she announced proudly, as if she were passing down a family heirloom. Cousin Rachel presented her with a gift card to a local spa. "For a day of pampering," she added enthusiastically. Mom squealed with delight, showering each giver with effusive thanks, as though they had handed her diamonds. The parade of presents continued, a cookbook, a decorative vase, a basket of bath products. Mom treated each one like a treasure, emphasizing how thoughtful and perfect every gift was. Finally, it was Brandon and Emma's turn. They stood up simultaneously, beaming as if they were about to announce their engagement. "Mom," Brandon began, and I felt a strange pang of discomfort hearing him call her that. "Emma and I decided to get you something special." Emma pulled out her phone and displayed a photo of a massive 65-inch smart TV. "We already had it delivered and installed in your living room," she said proudly. Mom burst into tears of joy, hugging them both. "My wonderful, generous children. I can't believe you did this. You must have been saving for months." Everyone at the table cooed and admired their generosity. Then all eyes turned to me. Calmly, I reached into my purse and pulled out a small, elegantly wrapped box. Mom's expression changed instantly, her smile vanished, and her gaze darkened. "What's this supposed to be?" she asked, her voice tinged with irritation. I slowly slid the box across the table to her. "Open it and see," I said evenly. But instead of opening it, she simply stared at it. Her face flushed with anger, and her voice sharpened as she spat out, "This is exactly what I expected from you. You show up here in that plain dress, probably the only nice thing you own. You arrive in a taxi because you can't afford a car. And now this." She picked up the box with a sneer and added, "What could possibly be in here? A gift card to McDonald's?" With that, she tossed the box back onto the table. It rolled, leaving a scratch on the cheap veneer. Brandon and Emma snickered, covering their mouths as if trying to hide their inappropriate laughter. Some guests looked embarrassed, averting their eyes, but others seemed to enjoy the drama as though it were part of the evening's entertainment. Richard kept eating his dessert, completely unfazed. I silently picked up the box and brushed off the crumbs that had stuck to its elegant wrapping. The room was silent. Everyone was waiting to see what I would do next. "You know, Mom, it's funny," I said, tilting my head slightly and holding her gaze. "In this little box is a certificate for a 2-week luxury vacation to the Maldives. First-class flights, a 5-star resort, all inclusive. Total cost, $15,000. The color drained from her face. Emma dropped her fork with a clatter, and Brandon stopped chewing, his eyes wide. Mom stammered, struggling to find words. That's impossible. You can't afford something like that. You're lying. I couldn't help but laugh. You'd know what I can and can't afford if you'd shown even a passing interest in my life over the last 12 years. But let me enlighten you. I'm a senior director at Reynolds Marketing Group. I own an apartment downtown. And that taxi you mocked? I took it because I didn't want to leave my Mercedes parked in this neighborhood. Brandon opened his mouth as if to say something, but no words came. Emma blinked nervously, her smug expression melting into confusion. But since you're so sure I'm a failure, I continued with a cold smile, tucking the box back into my purse, then this clearly isn't for you. I wouldn't want to ruin your birthday. Enjoy your television. I've heard the resolution is almost as good as my home theater system. I stood up slowly, with deliberate poise, and turned toward the exit. The sharp click of my heels echoed through the stunned silence of the room. When I stepped out of the restaurant, my prearranged driver was already waiting by the door. I got into the car and headed straight to Aunt Sarah's house. She was waiting for me, as if she knew I would need her support. 2 cups of tea were already sitting on the coffee table, still steaming, with thin wisps of vapor curling into the air. I sat across from her and recounted everything that had happened. Some people never change, she said softly, sighing and shaking her head. Your mother always cared more about appearances than reality. We talked late into the evening, but our calm night was interrupted by the ringing of my phone. The number was unknown, but I immediately knew who it was. Stephanie, sweetheart, Mom began, her voice dripping with false sweetness. I've been thinking about what happened, and, I might have overreacted. If you're still willing to give me that gift, I'd gladly accept it. We could use it as a fresh start. I want to be part of your life again. We're family. I listened in silence, not interrupting her. Then, coldly and clearly, I replied, no. We're not family. We're just people who share some DNA. You don't want to rebuild our relationship, you just want that vacation package. I hung up. My phone kept ringing for days afterward. She tried calling from different numbers, her own, the house line, even Richard's phone. When she realized I wasn't going to answer, the messages started pouring in. Stephanie, please call me back. We need to talk. I didn't respond. My silence was louder than any words could be. Each new message from her became more transparent than the last. I was thinking about what you said about your job. Maybe you could help Brandon get into marketing, he's so creative. The next day, another one, Emma mentioned she'd love to intern at a big company like yours. It would look great on her college applications. Then, the house needs a bit of repair, and since you're doing well, maybe you could help out. No apologies. No acknowledgement of the past. Just an endless stream of requests and hints, as though I were an ATM she had suddenly remembered existed. It was like watching a desperate gambler trying to claw their way back after a losing streak, but instead of money, Mom was trying to regain control, and the illusion of a perfect family she had destroyed herself. I read each message with a strange detachment, as though I were analyzing a case at work. Her tactics were almost impressive in their variety. First, she appealed to guilt. I'm your mother. How can you ignore me? Then came flattery. You've become such a successful woman. I'm so proud of you. Next were manipulations. Family is supposed to help family. And finally, threats. I'll tell everyone how you abandoned your mother when she needed you. Her persistence became a topic of conversation with Aunt Sarah. She won't stop calling me, Sarah said over the phone a week after I'd returned to the city. She even showed up at my house today. What did you say to her? I asked, already knowing the answer. I told her to get off my property before I called the police, Aunt Sarah replied with a hint of amusement in her voice. You should have seen her face. She claims she had the right to know where her daughter lives. But I reminded her that she gave up that right years ago. I pictured the scene, Mom standing on Sarah's porch in one of her expensive outfits, trying to assert herself with the fake confidence she always wore. But now, it just looked desperate. She didn't take it well, Sarah added. She ranted about how ungrateful we are, about everything she sacrificed for you. I'm pretty sure the neighbors heard her yelling. I sighed, feeling a mix of anger and relief. Stephanie, be careful, Aunt Sarah warned. She seemed desperate. Don't worry, I assured her. I've blocked her on everything, social media, my phone, email. Even the security team at my office knows not to let her in. After our conversation, I walked through my apartment. The modern furniture I had chosen with care, the paintings on the walls that reflected my taste, the windows overlooking the city, it was all mine. I had earned it. I thought about Mom and her sudden interest in my life. Now that she knew about my success, her behavior was almost comical. She had once discarded me in favor of her illusion of a perfect family, and now she was desperately trying to claw her way back for the illusion of my success. Still, despite everything, she had taught me a valuable lesson. Family isn't about legal documents or shared blood. It's about love, support, and being there for each other through good times and bad. And that was something I'd always had with Aunt Sarah. The next morning, I called the travel agency and changed the name on the vacation package to Sarah Carter. When I told her about it, she tried to refuse at first, but I insisted. You deserve this more than anyone, I said. You've been more of a mother to me than she ever was. Aunt Sarah pulled me into a tight hug, her warm arms wrapping around me in a way that no other embrace ever could. For the first time in years, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be.